preach on? How that was transformative in any certain way? Kind of how the word did its job in this process?
One of the accusations made against me was that I was not preaching the gospel. And I couldn't figure it out. I mean, I just could not figure out what these people meant by that. And then I got some help from some good friends of mine who had been at the church for a long time, and basically the kind of preaching that had been dominant and popular there at Coral Ridge for a long time was, let's say, a sermon on, how to have a happy family, or how to be a good parent, or a sermon, a lot of times, at least toward the end, a political sermon. And then at the very end of that sermon, tacking on an evangelistic invitation to unbelievers. And that was gospel sermonizing, gospel preaching. And so I came in with a completely different paradigm. I mean, gospel preaching for me was unpacking the centrality of Christ in and through every text in a way that helps both believers and unbelievers see the sufficiency and the necessity of Christ. And what gospel-centered preaching really means is uncovering and revealing the Christ-centered plot line in all the Bible. And so I decided that I was going to preach through the book of Jonah when I first got there, in large part because I think that, at least as best as I could tell, what had happened over the course of the years at Coral Ridge was, because so many of the sermons were about the need to address the cultural idols outside the church and the need to reclaim America for Jesus and those sorts of things. What had happened unintentionally was the congregation developing an astute ability to identify the idols outside the church, but they were altogether blind to the idols inside the church, and even more painfully, the idols inside their own hearts. So when there is a constant, steady stream of preaching that tells you what's wrong with the world, then it unintentionally develops a very thick, self-righteous culture inside the church that makes people believe we are what is right with the world and they are what is wrong with the world. It's the homosexuals, it's the abortionists, it's the Democrats, it's Obama, it's, whatever. So I decided to preach through Jonah because Jonah is such a remarkable book. It's a story presentation of the gospel, and it's a remarkable book demonstrating how many idols exist inside the hearts of Christian people, inside the church. I mean, Jonah was, he was one of the good guys. He was a prophet, he was a preacher, he was an Israelite, he belonged to God's covenant community, and he was God's primary target in and through the story of Jonah. I mean, as wicked as the Ninevites were, as nasty as the pagan sailors were, I mean, it was Jonah that was God's primary target, and it was a book that helped me sort of develop this paradigm that the gospel is for Christians too. That once God saves us, he doesn't then move us beyond the gospel, he moves us more deeply into the gospel, that the gospel is just as important after you become a Christian as it is before you become a Christian, because I would say things like, on Sunday morning, if you've been a Christian for 50 years, you need the gospel just as much today as all of the homosexuals down in Wilton Manors, which is a dominant homosexual community in South Florida, as all the homosexuals in Wilton Manors need it. Well, I mean, that was just, that was a terrible pill for them to swallow. I mean, because for so long, they had thought, no, they need the gospel. We don't. We have it, because they associated the gospel with justifying grace only and not sanctifying grace. And so it became, that was the centrality of the word launched both the problems. I mean, I could have chosen an easier subject to address as my first sermon series. Surprised by Grace, the book you mentioned, is an expanded version of that sermon series. But I mean, it was the word that both, and you alluded to this, Mike, but I mean, it was the word, it was the gospel through the book of Jonah that both weeded people out and weaved people in. And that's the effect that the word has. I mean, now I look out at Coral Ridge on Sunday mornings and the sanctuary's packed and people are alive and the gospel is having an effect, and I look out and I see 1/3 of the people are people who were former Coral Ridge people who were there when the merger happened. 1/3 of the people are people who came over from New City, and 1/3 are brand new people. And 1/3 left a year and a half ago. So it's just, it just shows that the gospel does weave people in, and the gospel does weave people out. And the gospel is a stumbling block to the self-righteous. I mean, the Bible makes that very clear. So you won't always get a good response. It's not like we get up and we preach the word and, the people are going to flock. I mean, there are some people who will hate us for that. So it played a primary central role in helping rebrand, replant, recast the whole philosophy of ministry, recast our whole theology of worship. I mean, it was absolutely central. Helping this one new church understand what gospel-centeredness is from top to bottom in the life of a church. All of that happened first through the pulpit ministry that God gave me.
Scott, do you mind if I just make an application here? Thank you for not only sharing your story, but helping us to see your challenges in your story, and even confessing your sin as part of your story. I would encourage you. That's a great model of how to communicate a story where you're just not God's man in the moment, but you're also acknowledging your failure and your sin. I don't think we do transitions real well as evangelicals, and too often we don't see beyond our own term, beyond our own ministry. And I think we really need to recognize that there's someone else that's going to be replacing us someday. And so the application I would want to make is plant your church and build your church with your replacement in view, because we're all being replaced, okay? Eventually it's coming to all of us, and why wait until that final week to realize, oh, I need to set things up for somebody else to succeed. It seems like being gospel-centered needs to mean being gospel-transferring. And that's 2 Timothy 2, isn't it? The things I've entrusted to you, these entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. And that shouldn't just end with our generation. I mean, we should be setting this up for the next generation to be able to take this thing so that pastors don't need to go through challenges in the transition. So I want to encourage you, as you're planting your church and as you get established in that church and begin building it, let folks know that there's somebody coming after you and that you're building your church, that your definition of success will be the successful transferal of this gospel ministry into the hands of another person.
Well, and the gospel alone can empower you to do that, because the gospel alone can enable you to rejoice and revel in your expendability. I mean, because Jesus was someone, you're now free to be no one. And that is a huge liberation. I mean, especially, I know the temptation, especially for church planters, pastors in general, but church planters in particular, to locate all of your meaning and security and significance and purpose and value and worth and identity in the success of your church. Like I said earlier, if your church succeeds, you're a success. If your church fails, you're a failure. I mean, none of us, or very few of us, would admit that, but that looms large in every church planter's heart. There is this terrible fear of failure, because if the church fails, I fail. And only the gospel can free you from that pressure to perform, because the gospel shouts and announces that your identity is in Christ, that everything you need in Christ you already possess. So now you're actually free to go to the back instead of get to the front. You're actually free to give instead of take. And that's huge. I mean, there is no possibility to successfully transition yourself or your church unless a robust gospel theology is worked into the deepest fabric of your being, because you've got to be able to say, I'm expendable. And I'm actually freed in the realization that I'm expendable. I mean, I can be a nobody. Because Jesus was extraordinary for me, I'm now free to be ordinary. Because Jesus was someone for me, I'm now free to be no one. So I'm an owner of nothing and a steward of everything.
And the gospel announces that we have all of the approval that we need, and we have that in Christ. And so we don't need to live or to construct a ministry that is ever seeking to derive approval from people based upon what we do or how we preach or how we're doing our ministry, but we have all of that we need in the gospel.
If you don't have that mindset at the outset, statistically speaking, most of us will not plant churches that last very long. And so if this is all about you and affirming you, then you're going to be depressed and feel like a failure. Or even worse, it may actually succeed, and people might come and the church might thrive, and then it's all about you. And God will get your attention, but it's going to be more painful that way. So,
well, and I'll tell you, I don't know if this was for you as well. I know it was certainly the case for me. There were some really tough decisions that we had to make, in order to get this ship that was sinking back to the surface. I mean, there were some really hard decisions that we knew were going to be unpopular. And I'm telling you right now, I mean, unless you get the gospel and unless you understand what Dave just said, that all of the approval and all of the acceptance and all of the affection that you long for, which in and of itself is not a bad thing, it turns into a bad thing when you locate or you search for acceptance and approval in anything smaller than Jesus. But in and of itself, it's not a bad thing. But unless you know that all of the approval and all of the acceptance and all of the affection you long for, you already have in Christ, you will never have the sharp mind, the soft heart, or the steel spine to walk into a difficult meeting and say, this is what we got to do. And be willing to have them throw you to the curb. I mean, I'm serious. Unless you are willing to be thrown to the curb, you'll never be the kind of gospel-soaked, gospel-intoxicated leader that your church needs you to be. You have to be willing. It's only the gospel that can enable you to say crazy, counterintuitive, risky stuff like to live as Christ, to die as gain. Only the gospel can help you say that. Only the gospel can empower you to say that, because everything I need in Christ I have. So now you can throw me to the curb. You can take away my reputation. You can take away the pulpit. You can take away this church. You can take away all my support. You can take it all. And in essence, you've taken away nothing, because Jesus plus nothing for me equals everything. That's huge. I mean, I just can't stress that enough. If it weren't for the empowerment of the gospel, I would have jumped off the remarkably tall steeple of Coral Ridge long before this thing came to an end. So.